Good afternoon. Is this working? Yes. Good afternoon. I am Steve Swain, a professor of music here at Dartmouth College and the director of the college's Montgomery Fellows Program. We gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Western Abenaki, who were and are part of the Wabanaki Confederation. By way of reminder, we'll need to be wearing masks, all of us, and for those of you who are not on campus regularly, there is a contact tracing form in the back, I believe, where there is also a hand sanitizer. So if you will give us your information before you exit, we would greatly appreciate that. The Montgomery Fellows Program brings exceptional people to an exceptional place. That exceptional place, of course, is Dartmouth College. But it also is the Montgomery House on Ockham Pond, which was purchased in 1977 through the generosity of Kenneth Montgomery, class of 1925, and his wife, Harl. Our fellow today is the college's 259th resident fellow who comes to share with us his life and wisdom. 3 days ago, my husband and I returned from our first ever trip to Greece. For 1 week, I hosted a group of a dozen Dartmouth alumni travelers on a cruise around the Aegean Islands. For another week, we traveled the mainland with another couple. Throughout our travels, I kept thinking I couldn't wait to return and query both our fellow and his introducer about what we were seeing and what I was thinking. The person providing the introduction today has her own stories to tell. Julie, I meant to ask you how you pronounce your last name. Do we pronounce the H? The H is silent, yes?
English. The H is silent.
All right, Julie Ruby is an assistant professor of classical studies here with an odyssey at Berea College that continues to enthrall me. She excelled in her undergraduate years at Duke, triple majoring. We tell people not to do that. Triple majoring in art history, classical studies, and classical languages. Show off. And her doctorate from the University of University of Cincinnati is in Aegean prehistory with our fellow as one of her advisors. Archaeological fingerprints are among Julie's specialties. I think Clytemnestra and Aegisthus need to be super careful with you around. Indeed, now having seen Mycenae and Delos and Olympia and Delphi, I have a deeper appreciation for what you and your tribe do in our world today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ruby.
Thanks so much, Steve, for that really nice introduction. And I'm happy to answer questions later. I first met our speaker, Brian Rose, in the late winter of 1996 when I visited the University of Cincinnati to decide whether I wanted to go to graduate school in classical archaeology there. My first impression has held up ever since, that he is both a kind person and a brilliant one. I hadn't noticed at that point how hard he worked, but I learned that later when I noticed that if I came in at 8 in the morning, he was already working. And if I left at 10 at night, he was also still working. Brian is notable for so many professional achievements that I can't enumerate them all, or we will never, ever get to his talk. He has a 40-page plus CV. So among his highlights of his CV are directing the post-Bronze Age excavations at the site of Troy from 1988 through 2012, and directing the Granicus Valley Survey Project from 2003 to 2007, and currently directing excavations at the site of Gordion in Turkey. He also has served as the president of the Archaeological Institute of Archaeological Institute. I wrote this down wrong. The Archaeological Institute of America, which is known as the AIA, which is North America's largest and oldest nonprofit dedicated to the study of archaeology. He has served as the Peter C. Ferry Curator-in-Charge of the Mediterranean section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the Penn Museum's Chief Curator and Deputy Director. He's been a trustee of the American Academy in Rome since 2001, where he currently serves as the chair of the executive committee of the Board of Trustees. He also currently serves as the president of the American Research Institute in Turkey. His publication record is equally impressive. He has served as the English language editor of the journal Studia Troica, published under the auspices of the University of Tübingen and the University of Cincinnati, that contains the excavation reports and specialist studies about Troy and the Troad. He's published a book on dynastic commemoration and imperial portraiture in the Julio-Claudian period, co-edited and edited multiple works on Phrygian Gordion, and written The Archaeology of Greek and Roman Troy. He currently has several Troy volumes forthcoming, including one on Hellenistic and Roman houses at the Lower City, and 2 on the West Sanctuary. His articles are simply too numerous to list. Brian has received numerous prestigious awards, including the gold medal from the AIA, fellowships from the American Academy in Rome, the American Academy in Berlin, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, the Loeb Classical Library Foundation, and the American Research Institute in Turkey. In 1994, he and his collaborator, Manfred Korfmann, received the Max Planck Prize of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and in 2012, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he is a corresponding member of the German Archaeological Institute and the Austrian Archaeological Institute. As the president of the AIA, Brian instituted 2 programs that are relevant to our theme this term, Who Owns the Past? One was a set of discussions with the Association of Art Museum Directors about revising their code of ethics. The other was a program to send archaeologists to address members of the military who were to be dispatched to archaeology-rich locations in the Middle East, speaking with them about the importance of preserving cultural heritage resources and their obligations under the rules of war to protect the cultural heritage of the places where they would be stationed. His talk today, Archaeology, Museums, and War, Strategies for the 21st Century, addresses the question of how archaeology and museums can and should interact with contemporary situations that are characterized by armed conflict. Please join me in welcoming Brian Rose.
My thanks to Steve and Julie for wonderful introductions, and to all of you for welcoming me to the Dartmouth community. And with Steve's agreement, I'm going to take off my mask for the duration of the talk. This will be very much an autobiographical talk, focused in particular on the unexpected detours that occur in one's scholarly career. Even though most of us, early in our careers, form a fairly clear idea of where we think our professions will take us, we're invariably led in intellectual directions we could never have anticipated. And these, in turn, require us to reinvent ourselves as both person and scholar. In my case, that reinvention came during the last 2 decades with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was a fairly typical Mediterranean archaeologist before the wars started, digging at the site of Troy in northwest Turkey. The wars I studied had occurred at least 2,000 years ago, and I never imagined that I'd be dealing with the military in combat zones, nor that I would simultaneously be pulled into another set of battles, one involving the antagonistic relationship that existed between archaeologists and curators, and the other linked to the return or repatriation of antiquities to Mediterranean and Near Eastern countries. All of these issues came to the fore during my work with the Archaeological Institute of America, or AIA. And the AIA forms the backdrop of much of what I treat in this talk, which explores the challenges that face art historians, archaeologists, and museum professionals in what has become a new era of cultural stewardship for us. I begin with a discussion of the ways in which the past now dominates the present, followed by an overview of the Penn Museum's recent involvement with cultural heritage destruction and preservation programs in conflict zones. This will lead back to the subject of museums and repatriation requests in an age of increasing nationalism. I close with some words on the future of archaeological projects in the Near East and on the current relationship between archaeologists and curators. It's difficult for us to realize the impact of the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria on art historians and curators who deal with the art and material culture of antiquity. Let's take a look at the cross-section of academic conferences dealing with antiquity during the last 2 decades. One finds that the same words continually appear: war and destruction, conflict and battle, trauma and violence. This is true in scholarly publications as well, where the same themes are highlighted. Books such as Combat Trauma and the Greeks, Conflict in Ancient Greece and Rome, War as Spectacle, and Landscapes of Violence are now the norm rather than the exception. One of the most interesting parallel developments is a compression of the time periods separating antiquity from the contemporary world, so that the two are now regularly viewed side by side. Books such as Achilles in Vietnam, Odysseus in America, and Ajax in Iraq are cases in point and demonstrate that it's sometimes easier for us to understand modern wars by viewing them through the lens of ancient conflicts, especially the Trojan War. In new programs such as Theater of War, in fact, ancient and modern combat trauma are interlinked, with Afghan and Iraq war veterans reading from ancient Greek plays about the Trojan War to highlight the timelessness of post-traumatic stress. We've recently created a similar type of program at the Penn Museum in tandem with the nearby Veterans Administration Hospital, in which we present ancient material culture linked to war, combat, and trauma that's repurposed for modern veterans. Our goal in this program, entitled Eternal Soldier, is to demonstrate to veterans that their emotional, spiritual, and psychological experiences are part of a diachronic continuum that reaches back to antiquity. At the same time, the objects in our collections become tied to the healing process for the soldiers who view them, which is a very different role from the one in which we traditionally cast them. The late Bronze Age letters from Egyptian soldiers stationed in Canaan, for example, highlight the heat and desolation of the faraway bases to which they had deployed. And a brief text panel can make these letters immediately relevant to the veterans of the Afghan and Iraq wars, as has been done in our Canaan and Israel gallery. You can easily read the letter. "I'm dwelling in Damnationville with no supplies. Those that I brought are gone. I spend the day eyeing the road home with longing. The heat here never lets up." Those words were written in the 14th century BC, but they could just as easily have been composed by an American soldier in Iraq in 2006. Tied to this telescoping of ancient and modern warfare is an acknowledgement of the continuity of triumphal imagery, wherein ancient iconographic schemes convey the same point in a different configuration. One of the most famous scenes on Trajan's column in Rome, for example, includes a group of Roman soldiers holding the severed heads of captive Dacians, who were presented to the emperor as a sign of the Romans' triumph on the battlefield. One can easily find photos of Taliban and ISIS soldiers holding the severed heads of their enemies to the cameras, at times posing in exactly the same manner as Trajan's soldiers. It's no longer uncommon to see such scenes placed together as a way of demonstrating that even after 2,000 years, the severed human head is still a war trophy. The same conflation of past and present is apparent in our war memorials, and 2 examples succinctly indicate this point. After the Greek victory over the Persians at the Battle of Marathon in 490, the bodies of the dead soldiers were interred in a monumental burial mound, the primary decoration of which was a list of the names of the Athenians and their allies who had died in the battle. In essence, casualty lists. A similar solution, of course, was adopted by the designers of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington and the World Trade Center Memorial in New York, where it's the names of the dead that dominate the design. This link between ancient and modern also applies to other monuments focused on loss and tragedy. One relatively recent US example is the memorial in Oklahoma City commemorating the bombing of a federal office building in 1994 in which 168 people died. The concept for the decorative program involves a plaza full of empty chairs, each inscribed with the name of a person who died in the explosion, and each illuminated with an internal light. Here, too, one can point to ancient precedents, although they're not drawn from the usual categories. The image of the empty chair can be found in Roman mystery religions, especially the cults of Cybele, the Magna Mater, and Christ, as a sign that the deceased deity would rise again. And the Oklahoma Memorial, in a sense, carries the same connotation. If one were to pinpoint a single moment when much of the world became conscious of the interface between war and archaeology, it would probably be the looting of the Archaeological Museum in Baghdad in 2003. Although estimates vary, it seems likely that 15,000 objects were stolen, many of which figured among the most important examples of ancient art surviving from Mesopotamia. Occurring at the same time was the large-scale plundering of archaeological sites throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, which transformed them into landscapes resembling the craters of the moon, as you see in the lower slide at Sabalam. It's impossible to determine which objects were stolen from these sites, and the problem has been accelerated by the civil war in Syria that still continues. Compounding the problem of cultural heritage protection is a staggering rise in historical iconoclasm, wherein the surviving testaments to pre-Islamic cultures in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan are systematically being erased. The most well-known examples include the bombing of the Temple of Baal in Palmyra, the destruction of the Hatra statues in the Mosul Museum, and the defacing of the apotropaic Lamassu figure in Nimrud in northern Iraq, although the damage has become so widespread that we may never be able to compile a complete list. Iconoclasm has been a regular feature of human society since the beginning of recorded history, but we're now seeing a manipulation of historical memory on an unprecedented scale, with landscapes defined more by absence than by presence. Indeed, in the case of the colossal Buddha statues at Bamiyan in central Afghanistan, destroyed by the Taliban in 2001, the empty shell once occupied by the Buddha stands as a more powerful statement to the savagery of iconoclasm than any word or image could convey. All of these issues were brought home to me 17 years ago, in that I was in my second year as president-elect of the Archaeological Institute of America, or AIA. The reports of the destruction of museums, libraries, and archaeological sites throughout Iraq and Afghanistan were now being brought directly to me, and I was expected to respond proactively. Nothing in my training had prepared me for such a response. I had little knowledge of the cultural heritage of Central Asia and no understanding of either the military or of international diplomacy. And one thing that Julie did not mention is that I went to a Quaker college and was committed to nonviolence. Yet something had to be done. Looting at historic sites and cultural institutions throughout these areas had increased dramatically, as had iconoclasm. Bringing archaeologists from Iraq and Afghanistan to the next annual meeting of the AIA in San Francisco in 2004 seemed to be the best course of action, and funds quickly offered by the Packard Humanities Institute made it possible. Donnie George, the director of the Iraq Museum, agreed to come, as did Abdulwasi Firouzi, who I've circled in red in the upper left, the Director General of the National Institute of Archaeology in Afghanistan. Although the sudden death of the director of the Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage shortly before our annual meeting prevented Dr. George's participation. In the course of the conference, Dr. Firouzi described the campaign of iconoclasm promoted by the Taliban, as well as the rampant looting of museums and archaeological sites throughout his country. In addition, he emphasized the sale of increasing numbers of undocumented Afghan and Iraqi antiquities on eBay. He lamented the fact that the soldiers deployed in Afghanistan had little or no sense of the cultural heritage of the region. Those comments put the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan in a new perspective for me. We realized that we needed a program wherein archaeologists would go to US military bases and teach the cultural heritage of Iraq and Afghanistan to the soldiers who were preparing to deploy to those countries. Since US soldiers had become the primary security agents at both archaeological sites and museums, we thought that such briefings would promote a greater comprehension of and respect for the cultural heritage of the areas in conflict. I hope that this, in turn, would play a role in decreasing the number of antiquities smuggled out of the country and onto the art market. I had no idea how to do any of this, and inaugurating such a project was easier said than done. The AIA and academics in general had no clear channels of communication to the military then. Archaeologists had periodically interfaced with the US Armed Forces in the past, especially during World War II, when they helped to pinpoint and safeguard archaeological sites and identify and repatriate looted works of art. These individuals, of course, were the so-called monuments officers, some of whom became directors of America's leading art museums. But there had been very little interaction between the AIA and the military since that time. And during the Vietnam War, the level of mistrust and animosity between academics and the military increased dramatically. In other words, for over 3 decades, academics and the military had not really been speaking to each other, except in anger. Nevertheless, after 9 months of trying, and with the aid of Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, our program was approved by the US Central Command, and it continued for 13 years at Fort Bliss, Camp Lejeune, and Fort Dix, among many others, and occasionally in the field in Iraq, at Talil Air Base, and in Afghanistan, in Kabul and in Ghazni. So you see me in Iraq, in southern Iraq on upper right, and in Ghazni, southern Afghanistan on lower right. Once I'd secured approval, I had to find lecturers who could give the briefings in cultural heritage protection, history of archaeology, history and archaeology of Iraq and Afghanistan, and this highlights the importance of flexibility. Academics are accustomed to lecture tours in which we're given generous introductions, as I was today, taken out to dinner, as I will be tonight, and sometimes put up in hotels that are quite luxurious, as Montgomery House is. That doesn't happen in the Army. Training schedules can change suddenly, and one has to react rapidly and diplomatically to alterations in the timing and locations of the briefings. Finding archaeologists who were willing to adapt to this routine proved problematic, and I finally turned to archaeology professors who had served in the Vietnam War, such as Paul Zemansky, Al Leonard, and Jim Wright. I also didn't anticipate that I would be expected to speak on Iraqi and Afghan cultural heritage from antiquity to the present, including society and religion. When one of the soldiers asked me what she could expect to find in terms of regional variations in Islam in northern Afghanistan, I noted that this was beyond my expertise, and she replied, "But this is the only unit on culture in pre-deployment training." So we expanded the range of our lectures accordingly to the best of our abilities. We spent a lot of time on the basics of architectural and object conservation, outlining the emergency conservation methods with which troops need to be familiar when they're the first to enter museums or libraries that have been struck by rockets. What do you do when you enter a museum whose water pipes have burst and the floor or shelves have collapsed after the rocket attack? Knowing the fundamentals of conservation can rescue the objects in a museum that are considered sacred by the surrounding community, which is fundamental to winning support in those communities. Many of our sessions are held at the Penn Museum so that we can train soldiers in the galleries with the same kinds of objects that they may encounter in the field. Similar troop lecture programs have now been adopted in Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Bulgaria, among others, and we continue to urge the adoption of such programs for the military police in Iraq and Afghanistan. All of the lessons taught in our cultural heritage training sessions are repeated on decks of playing cards that are distributed to soldiers deploying abroad. And this was the brainchild of Laurie Rush, archaeologist at Fort Drum in New York. She realized that troops would often deploy to areas with no electricity and would play cards in their off hours, so they might as well learn while doing so. One of our intentions was to communicate the sense of loss experienced by Iraqis and Afghans when their monuments are destroyed in combat. One of the cards, for example, features the Statue of Liberty with the caption, "How would we feel if someone destroyed her torch?" which conveys the point very strongly. I began to view these lessons in a new light when I was sent to southern Afghanistan in 2012 to do some training sessions in cultural heritage protection. On my last day in Ghazni, demonstrations erupted throughout the country in response to the burning of a Quran by a minister in Florida, which had been posted on YouTube and had received international publicity. Some of the demonstrations turned violent, and several UN personnel and Afghan civilians were killed. For all of us, I think, the burning of books occupies the same general sphere as the Taliban's destruction of the colossal Buddhas in central Afghanistan 20 years ago. Both books and icons often constitute the nucleus of a community. It's therefore not surprising that they are so frequently the target of attacks by conquerors, by those who follow a different religion, or by those who seek to wound a community for whatever reason. This kind of iconoclastic fervor has been a component of society since the beginning of recorded history 5,000 years ago, and we often ask how we can make a difference. Perhaps the most potentially productive course of action lies in children's education, which is a mode of outreach that many professors have typically shied away from. The sanctity of cultural property and the injustice of iconoclasm are themes that can and should be integrated into children's curricula year after year, and we need to be a part of that planning. This alone will not bring an end to iconoclasm, but it may cause one fewer book to be burned and one fewer person to iconoclasm. But it may cause one fewer book to be burned and one fewer person to be killed in response to that burning. Finding a way to communicate the loss of cultural heritage in a memorial has become increasingly difficult because the nature of the adversity commemorated by the monument has changed so radically. There are no longer necessarily two sides to a conflict, nor any clear victors, which means that the selection of appropriate words and images have stymied the designers of such monuments. Let's take the example of the memorial planned to commemorate the Kent State University shootings in 1970 during the Vietnam War, when 4 students were shot by members of the Ohio National Guard. What words and images are appropriate for such a memorial? In the end, the sculptor George Siegel chose to filter it through the lens of antiquity, using the biblical analog of Abraham poised to sacrifice his son Isaac. But even this was considered too controversial, and the memorial was eventually moved to Princeton, where you can now see it. There appears to be a growing conviction, in fact, that figural imagery can no longer adequately express the horror of the subject in question, and we can see this in the designs developed for the World Trade Center Memorial. One of the most potent solutions involved the use of the surviving ruined facade of the World Trade Center as the centerpiece of the new memorial's design. Athens did the same thing on the Acropolis after the Persian Wars in the early 5th century BC, when the first Parthenon was showcased as a ruin to highlight the barbarity of the Persians. Similar solutions, of course, were adopted during World War II, or immediately following World War II, by Berlin, Hiroshima, and Coventry. In the end, the surviving fragments of the building of the World Trade Center were assembled in a warehouse and distributed as the primary components of memorials to cities throughout the country. These two tie into the issue of power and lead one to question how power is measured. Some would argue that the ultimate indication of power occurs when an object is divided into a number of pieces, and each piece still possesses the same level of power as the original object. The relics of saints operated this way during the Middle Ages, and the pieces of the World Trade Center are really no different. These are, in fact, our relics. Many of these regional monuments are intended to be touched, which is another striking feature of war memorial design within the last 50 years, as two very different examples illustrate. One of them, in Berlin's Jewish Museum, is a sculptural installation by Menashe Kadishman entitled Shalaket, or Fallen Leaves. One of the museum's largest rooms is filled with over 10,000 circular iron plates in which are cut open-mouthed faces suggestive of screaming. The sound of visitors walking on the exhibit, which they are encouraged to do, creates a rattle as they fight to maintain their balance. In essence, visitors are cast in an active role as perpetrators of the violence evinced by the monument. To an extent, one witnesses similar phenomenon in Saddam Hussein's triumphal parade route in central Baghdad, where Iraqi soldiers were intended to walk on captured Iranian helmets embedded in the parade route's concrete path. In both situations, one literally walks on heads as a trigger to memory, with sound and touch as important as sight. It's the power of images, and particularly the power of commemorative sculpture and architecture, that stimulated a range of forceful reactions during the last 25 years, ushering in a new obsession with political iconoclasm. In some cases, it's abundantly clear which political monuments should be documented and protected. At other times, the situation is more ambiguous. What of the recent destruction of statues of men now branded as dictators, such as those of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, Lenin in Berlin, and Marcos in the Philippines, among many others? Should we consider these as cultural property, and should they be preserved? For me, these are historical documents, and I would argue against the destruction of history under any circumstances. If those images are linked to racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, or other injustices, I would install them in a museum with explanatory text panels, but I would not destroy them. The residents of the countries in question obviously feel differently, and in the end, it's their decision to make. I dealt with this decision when I was lecturing in southern Iraq at the air base near the site of Ur, and the archaeology supervisor for the district showed me a building that was labeled as the house of the biblical prophet Abraham. He explained that the house was built from scratch in 1999 because the Pope had announced his intention to visit pilgrimage sites in the Near East during the Vatican's Jubilee year of 2000. And Saddam Hussein believed that if he built a house for Abraham in Ur, the Pope would travel to Iraq, and Saddam's stature would rise as a consequence. The supervisor, standing at the right, wanted the building destroyed because it was a component of Saddam's political propaganda. I explained that it was now part of the history of the site, and while a sign should certainly be erected explaining the propagandistic role of the building, it shouldn't be destroyed. Although he disagreed strongly with my arguments, as you can see in looking at his body language, the building still stands as far as I know. The same supervisor also highlighted the post-2003 currency of Iraq, which features on the reverse a miniature version of the figural scenes of the law code of Hammurabi, where the king receives the wisdom of the sun god Shamash. The Iraqi pride in having been the source of the first written law code overrides all strictures against the representation of pagan gods. And it's emblematic of the rising nationalism that we've witnessed almost everywhere, but especially within the last 25 years, following the breakup of the Soviet Union. Countries searching for a new identity have reached back to antiquity to find a heroic figure around whom the entire community can unite. The Armenian hero Haik, or Alexander the Great in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, are two more cases in point. Even in America, we have witnessed this phenomenon of rising nationalism. After the 9/11 attacks, American flags grew exponentially in size, becoming so large that it was no longer easy to carry them. Coupled with this rise in nationalism has been stronger antiquities legislation, both in the US and abroad, as well as more aggressive attempts to secure the repatriation of antiquities looted from the country of origin. When these antiquities are returned, they're treated like heroes coming home after a period of wandering. The catalog of repatriated antiquities in Italy in 2007-8, for example, was entitled Nostoi, the Greek word for the journeys of the Homeric heroes who returned to their homes following the Trojan War. The repatriated antiquities, in other words, were considered analogous to war-weary veterans. On the internet, the Athenian Acropolis marbles in the British Museum now speak in first person. I am Greek and I want to go home. This is, in my experience, a new phenomenon in the larger scheme of repatriation advertising. It's expressed even more powerfully in the new Acropolis Museum in Athens, where empty spaces in the exhibit call attention to the Parthenon reliefs now in London that have been requested for repatriation. Again, we find a case of absence as argument, not unlike the empty throne motif in antiquity. I dealt with the issue of repatriation 9 years ago in a situation that again demonstrated to me the importance of flexibility, creativity, and communication for museum curators. The repatriation request came from Turkey in regard to a group of early Bronze Age gold jewelry that the Penn Museum had acquired in 1966, dated to about 2400 BC. The negotiations regarding the fate of the gold lasted for 11 months until September of 2012, and I realized how significantly repatriation requests have changed during the 21st century. The UNESCO Convention of 1970 certainly entered into our discussions, but I found that it was regarded by Turkey as essentially irrelevant, and new models had to be proposed in the quest for a solution. The Penn Museum's Trojan gold consists of 24 pieces of jewelry of early Bronze Age date, similar in style to Heinrich Schliemann's Treasure of Priam, and therefore commonly linked to Troy. In the initial publications, written in the late 1960s by George Bass, then a curator at the Penn Museum, he highlighted the difficulty in pinpointing the provenance of the jewelry and was not convinced that all the objects were from the same site. He noted their strong similarities to the early Bronze Age jewelry of Troy in northwest Turkey, Polyokni on the northern Aegean Greek island of Lemnos, and Ur in southern Iraq. The Penn Museum's purchase of this assemblage in 1966 prompted a series of discussions that ultimately led to the formulation of the Pennsylvania Declaration in 1970, a document intended to prohibit future acquisitions by the museum of unprovenanced antiquities. A few months later, but still in 1970, UNESCO formulated a convention designed to prevent the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. This has typically been viewed as a line in the sand by archaeologists. In other words, if an antiquity was acquired or published prior to 1970, its return would not be requested by the country where it was discovered. If its existence was first attested after 1970 and it had no known provenance, it may well be requested for return or repatriation by the country where it was likely found. In other words, from that point on, 1970 was treated as a fixed line in the sand regarding requests for the repatriation of antiquities. The Penn Museum's Troy gold was subsequently published and exhibited in a variety of books and journals, especially after the rediscovery in 1993 of Schliemann's Treasure of Priam in the basement depots of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. Despite the increased publicity for all things Trojan at that time, there were no claims for the repatriation of Penn's gold. In 2009, however, I brought two archaeometallurgists from Germany to examine the gold because I wasn't convinced that all of it was ancient. A few particles of soil were found lodged inside a tiny loop of gold on the back of one of the gold pendants, and neutron activation analysis revealed that the composition of the soil in the Penn Museum gold was consistent with the soil in the plain of Troy. Ernst Perniczka, the lead scientist, said that it was not proof of provenance, but it was a good bet that Penn's enigmatic collection had come from somewhere in the area of Trojan influence, Turkey, Greece, or southeastern Europe. This assessment appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer in January of 2010. There was considerable discussion among us before we released the scientific testing results to the newspaper, but our mission is to inform the public about the archaeological research that we conduct, so the decision to release the results was clear. Toward the end of 2011, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism contacted the Penn Museum regarding the potential transfer of the gold to Turkey based in large part on Perniczka's scientific analysis. A series of discussions then took place between Penn and the Turkish Ministry of Culture over the course of the next 11 months, from late September of 2011 through August of 2012. When the discussion began, we pointed out that the gold had been purchased 4 years before the UNESCO Convention of 1970 had been formulated. The officials from the ministry indicated that they were now following the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1906, and they compared their claim to the Trojan gold to the NAGPRA law in the US, the North American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. There were 3 reasons why we wanted to find a way to secure a compromise in this situation. Penn had been working in Turkey continually since 1950, primarily at the site of Gordion. The Penn Museum serves as the headquarters of the American Research Institute in Turkey, and we had written the Pennsylvania Declaration even before the UNESCO Convention of 1970 was drawn up. So the Declaration had become a strong component of our identity as a museum. The director at that time, Richard Hodges, initially proposed a 30-year loan, which was rejected by the ministry. I highlighted the fact that Greek and Near Eastern jewelry of mid to late 3rd millennium BC date exhibits an international style tied to the long-distance trade networks that crossed Asia and the Aegean. Jewelers moved back and forth throughout the region in antiquity, which makes it difficult to link unprovenanced jewelry to a specific site. The original provenance of the treasure is likely to be the Northeast Aegean, but whether the provenance was in an area now contained within the modern boundaries of Greece or Turkey could not be determined with certainty. This argument, too, was initially unsuccessful, although after further discussion, we came to an agreement on an indefinite loan, which was the farthest that Penn was willing to go since the precise provenance of the gold could not be established with 100% certainty. What this meant was that the Troy gold would go indefinitely to Ankara, the Turkish capital. In return, the ministry promised strong support for the continuation of Penn's excavations at Gordion, near Ankara, for as long as we like. Also promised was the loan to Penn of the assemblage from the Midas mound tomb at Gordion in central Turkey for an exhibit of 1 year's duration. This tomb was excavated by Penn in 1957 and yielded one of the most impressive royal funerary assemblages ever found in Anatolia, likely the tomb of King Midas' father in 740 BC. That exhibit, entitled The Golden Age of King Midas, opened at the Penn Museum in 2016 with over 120 objects borrowed from 4 museums in Turkey, and nearly 45,000 visitors came to see it. It's worth noting that Troy and its antiquities have been cast in a rather prominent role in recent political discourse concerning Turkey's entry into the European Union. Some have argued that because the Turkish site of Troy is the focus of the Iliad, and the Iliad lies at the foundation of the European cultural tradition, then Turkey, by extension, should be admitted to the European Union. This may have played a role in Turkey's request for the Penn Museum gold, although such claims from Turkey are not uncommon. I suppose what surprised me most about all of these activities was the absence of the UNESCO Convention in the discussions. The ministry no longer considered 1970 to be the line in the sand that I was always taught it had become, nor was I expecting a reversion to the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1906, but even this doesn't seem to be a fixed line. Turkey has called for the return of the marble statue of the so-called old fisherman from Aphrodisias, which entered the Pergamon Museum in Berlin in 1905, so before 1906. This suggests that, at least in the case of some countries, we've passed beyond the relative security that the UNESCO Convention offered to museums with antiquities collections, and we're now in what I would call uncharted territory. That applies as well to archaeological projects in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Since so many Near Eastern countries are now considered too potentially dangerous for field work, the number of archaeologists who choose to specialize in that region of the world will no doubt eventually decrease, even though the number of graduate applications in ancient Near Eastern archaeology and history has risen significantly since the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. These are times of transition, with the archaeological community gradually recognizing that the codes of conduct that have been in place for a century can no longer prevail in the countries in which we work or the world in which we live. For the student of archaeology today, then, the development of skills in diplomacy and creativity is just as important as those in archaeological techniques. But even highly developed diplomatic skills are not always enough, and I'll again use Turkey as an example. As many of you know, there was an attempted military coup in Turkey in July of 2016, which was devastating for the entire country, as it was for those of us conducting field work in Turkey at that time. The Turkish government has identified a cleric living in Pennsylvania as the agent behind the coup, and they have threatened to cancel American projects if he is not extradited. Turkey's dispute with the government of Austria in 2016 resulted in the cancellation of Austrian excavations at Ephesus for 2 years. So it's conceivable that the same decision could eventually be made regarding our projects. And what of the relationship between curators and archaeologists, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk? We have a long way to go, but this has improved noticeably. And again, I'll relate my own experience with this issue. My awareness of the extent of the antipathy between the two groups, archaeologists and curators, goes back to a conference on cultural property held at the New York Public Library in 2006. The discourse between representatives of the AIA and the Association of Art Museum Directors, or AAMD, was unusually angry, with some members of the AIA arguing that the purchase of undocumented antiquities led to an acceleration in the looting of archaeological sites, and some in AAMD maintaining that countries could no longer be trusted to safeguard the antiquities contained within their borders, citing the destruction of the Buddhas by the Afghan Taliban as an example. Many of these arguments were summarized shortly thereafter in James Cuno's book, Who Owns Antiquity?, wherein he linked the rise in nationalism to the spike in requests for repatriation, arguing that antiquities are the cultural property of all humankind. A few months later, I was discussing the newly renovated Greek and Roman galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art with a member of the AIA's governing board who asked me whether a visit to the galleries would violate the AIA's Code of Ethics, which prohibits participation in the trade in undocumented antiquities or in activities that enhance the commercial value of undocumented antiquities. Of course not, I replied, but the question caught me by surprise and highlighted in an instant how wide the gulf between archaeologists and museums had become. I reached out to Dan Monroe, director of the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, and at that time, president of the AAMD. Together, we established a working group with representatives from both AAMD and AIA, meeting out of the public eye. No topics would be off the table in our discussions, but passion would be tempered by diplomacy, and we would search for potential areas of agreement and collaboration. There have now been over 10 of these workshops, and from what I can see, the antipathy between curators and archaeologists has stopped. There are undoubtedly many reasons for this, but one is that the destruction of cultural heritage in the Near East and Central Asia during the last 2 decades has necessitated the necessity of working together. Equally important are the AAMD's recent guidelines recognizing 1970 and the UNESCO Convention as the threshold for future antiquities acquisitions. Although, as I've indicated, not every country recognizes the convention as a firm basis for repatriation negotiations. It's clear that we are no longer living in an era in which antiquities are regularly purchased from the art market by museums. This practice has largely ended, in part because so many countries have become more aggressive in pursuing litigation against museums, many cases of which have been successful, as we've seen most recently with the Museum of the Bible in Washington, although the Cleveland Museum of Art could also be cited, as could the St. Louis Art Museum. To this, I would add one important issue with which all curators and archaeologists continually grapple. The public will generally not make the effort to go to museums unless we offer them the same kind of compelling narratives that are featured in movies and television. And such narratives are far easier to construct if the objects being exhibited have a known provenance. Curators are storytellers. If the object derives from a controlled excavation, one can usually determine when, where, and why it was made, and how it functioned in the societies in which it operated. If an object has no provenance other than the ancient Mediterranean, the stories that can be wrapped around it are more limited in scope, and usually confined to a discussion of the iconography, if it exists, or to the object's function in generic activities, such as feasting or fighting. And sometimes, with unprovenanced ancient art, narrative is eschewed altogether and set on a stage that I would describe as sterile, as this example from the Manil collection in Houston illustrates. The objects are invited to speak for themselves, but without the curator as interpreter, I don't think that anyone hears them. Archaeologists and anthropologists have increasingly been asking a deceptively simple question: what do objects want? If I were to attempt an answer, I would say that they want their histories restored to them through the kinds of assemblages in which they're exhibited and the associated text panels that tell their stories. What they do not want is to be appreciated only for their aesthetic qualities. We're fortunate at Penn to have a largely provenienced collection that makes such storytelling possible. But for many other museums, this means arranging long-term loans with a series of countries, which is now more difficult politically than it once was. In the end, I suppose, we need to ask one fundamental question: what is the role of a museum in the 21st century? And do museums still need objects in a predominantly digital world? This, of course, was the title of a recent book by Stephen Kahn, and it's an issue with which archaeologists and curators continually wrestle. I would argue that there has never been a more urgent need for museums, but in order to remain relevant, museums need to accelerate their outreach to groups with which they have not typically engaged, and situate the objects they do have in narrative frameworks that are relevant for 21st century issues. For me, a museum is an institution that recognizes the power of objects to promote an understanding of the role of the past in the present, and resolves to extend that understanding to as many groups in society as possible. I think this image will summarize many of the points I've made tonight. This is a photo of the entrance to the Kabul Archaeological Museum in 2001, which was draped with a bilingual banner after Taliban control of the city had ended. A nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. Culture is the lifeblood of a nation, as I think we'd all agree, and our determination to safeguard culture is a unifying force. It's only by identifying common ground among archaeologists, museum curators, and politicians that we can continue to play a transformative role in keeping culture alive, and thus the nations associated with that culture. Thank you for listening to me tonight. Thank you for your support of cultural heritage protection. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure Brian would love to take questions. If you have a question for him, please go to one of the microphones because this is being recorded. And so in order for your question to be recorded, you need to go to a mic.
Well, since I'm at the microphone here, I'll start with the first one. Thank you, Brian, for just a fascinating, comprehensive talk. Confederate monuments, your thoughts?
I knew this was coming. This always comes. And that's why I put in that line about archaeologists are historians. I'm going to step away from that mic. Archaeologists are historians, and the objects in any city are historical documents. So can an archaeologist, as an historian, conscience the destruction of an historical document? Confederate statues are historical documents. Statues of Lenin, for me, are historical documents. Statues of Stalin, statues of Saddam Hussein. I suppose even statues of Hitler are historical documents. Not I suppose, they are historical documents. Can I conscience the destruction of an historical document? As an historian, I can't. Editing history is always a dangerous endeavor, so I can't really conscience it. However, as I said in this talk, if an object is exhibited in a central place in a city or a region and incites violence, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, racism, whatever it is, then I might well remove it from the place where it has typically been exhibited and put it in a museum surrounded by didactic panels that explain the conditions of its creation, the methods used to create it, the larger political climate that resulted in its creation, the reason why the statue or the monument is considered offensive to a variety of groups today, and then a larger statement about issues of iconoclasm, historical documents, and historical editing. That would be used as a teaching tool, both by, I think, primary school students, because I think for the more advanced primary school students, you could begin to approach this before they've learned to hate cultures different from their own. High school students, certainly, college students, graduate students, the educated public, it would be a teaching tool for everyone. So would I destroy them? I would not. But I might well move them to a museum. People then ask me, and maybe someone will, who's going to fund this museum? Who's going to fund a museum of prejudice filled with prejudiced monuments? I have no answer to that. But that, in essence, is my take on the problem, although it is a thorny problem and one with which we all wrestle. Thank you. Other questions? I have covered 3,000 years. 4,400.
Hi.
Hi.
Is this on? Sorry, I can't tell whether it's on. Okay, cool, thank you. Thanks for speaking today. I was curious as sort of a follow-up question. What if there's something that can't be physically moved? I'm thinking, for example, of Indian boarding schools. For those communities, they represent something extremely traumatic. And I could see the side that says, destroy it. We don't want to look at this anymore. We don't want to have it poisoning our feelings. So it may be sort of changing history in a sense, but in that situation, what would you say the approach could be?
So in other words, if it's, for example, carved in a cliff and literally cannot be moved.
Yeah.
No, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that before. I still wouldn't destroy it. I think I've made that clear. Would I change the landscape around it so that it was visually accessible only to those who chose to see it? Maybe, but if it's something like the colossal head of Ferdinand Marcos carved in a cliff in the Philippines, those are some pretty tall trees that you have to grow around it in order to screen it from regular vision. Do you have any thoughts on the issue yourself?
Well, I mean, I think,
What would you do? If you were in my position, what would you do?
well, I'm not in your position now.
But you will be someday. You will be someday. You think you won't be, but you will.
Perhaps. I mean, I think that where I am right now, I see human emotions today as very powerful things, and that a community needs to be able to make a choice for itself, for its own good. And while I think that, suggesting a change like that to obscure it from public view so that it wasn't sort of forced upon the viewer, that could be a good suggestion. I think I would support it if the community said that they wanted to just destroy it, something like that.
I mean, they did move the statues of Ramses II at Abu Simbel in Egypt to a different location, and those were unmovable. However, those were designated World Heritage Monuments by UNESCO. I mean, it was a different situation altogether. No one is going to pay to cut Ferdinand Marcos's head from the cliff in the Philippines and transport it to a museum. I need to think about that for a while. It's a good question. I would see if I could use the landscape as a screener, and if I couldn't, then I would have a dialogue with the community. And if the community said that no landscape screening was possible, I suppose, you never want to view a problem in black and white. There are always shades of gray. So if I had to do that then, if the community said this is too wounding for us as a nation, then after I documented it to the hilt, even scanning it, then it might have to be destroyed, although I would do that as a very last resort. This is a very good, thought-provoking question. Thank you. Yes?
Hi,
Hi.
thank you for your talk today. I guess my question would be, would you consider modern destruction or defacement of statuary or monuments as the creation of new historical documents, like declaring the collective values of a modern people? Isn't that equally the creation of documents as keeping existing ones?
It is. It is part of the history of the monument. The iconoclasm becomes part of the history of the monument. Would I take away the signs of the iconoclasm? I would not. It's part of the history of the monument. When I restore a monument, when I set up a building, an ancient building that's been destroyed by an earthquake, I don't fill in all the cracks and the crevices and the missing pieces. The fact that it was destroyed in an earthquake is part of its history. So I set it back up so that it's stable, but I leave the cracks and the crevices in place, because that historical component has to be visible to the viewer. So although I would get pushback from any number of communities for saying this, the iconoclasm needs to be documented. It needs to be apparent, because for me, these objects are almost human figures, and it's part of their life story, and so it needs to be apparent. So yes, I would exhibit it as part of its larger history. There was a question, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I was just going to ask a question on in terms of repatriation of objects regarding archaeological institutions of nations, that their archaeological institutions may have not been as developed in the 1970s or pre-1970 in order to recall objects, and how that might change regarding your views on repatriation for nations that have just now really begun to set up museums that can actually house these objects?
Yeah, I have to admit, that's a good question, thank you. My thinking has gone back and forth on this. When Turkey initially said to me, 1970 is not a line in the sand, we're going by 1906, I thought, well, you're going to upset all discussions about antiquities that have moved over the course of the last century if you get rid of this. I mean, if we don't have 1970, then can there be repatriation requests for objects that were moved by Napoleon in 1800? And if that's okay, can there be repatriation requests for objects that were looted by the Venetian Crusaders during the Fourth Crusade in 1204 and taken from Constantinople, which was a Greek empire, to Venice. Even though Constantinople is now Istanbul and part of modern Turkey. It's a mess. The only ones who would benefit would be lawyers who would buy country houses with all of the fees that they were accumulating due to these problems in international law. You know, after this year I spent negotiating with Turkey, I had to admit, if it's stolen, it's stolen. And if they ask for it back and it's clear that it came from their territory, from their region, then I would give it back, even though this would provoke a chain of events and a chain of lawsuits, litigation, that would create havoc with museums all over the world. But I keep coming back, as an archaeologist, to a basic line. If it's stolen, it's stolen. It should go back to where it was. Jim Cuno, who is a friend and whom I like very much, says in his book, Who Owns Antiquity, think of how many more people will see it in this museum in New York than would see it in Uşak in the middle of nowhere in Turkey. And we can put it on velvet backdrops as opposed to, you know, corrugated cardboard. The fact that you stole my ring and you can put it next to a fur coat as opposed to my cloth coat doesn't matter. If it's stolen, it's stolen. So in a large number of cases, I would now consider repatriating, even if the object has moved before 1970. Now, it's too bad that Patty Gerstenblith and I are not here together, because we could have a very rich conversation about this. And I will say, probably many of you heard Patty Gerstenblith's talk when the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism contacted me and said, if you don't return this gold, no one from Penn will ever work in Turkey again. And I thought, you know, I had always been one of the good guys, you know, on the right side of the desk. And now I found myself turning sort of into one of the bad guys on the other side of the desk. I had no idea what to do. Of course, I called Patty Gerstenblith, which is what we do. She's the 911 of cultural heritage issues. And she didn't know what to do either. And it took me a year of negotiation. And in the end, I actually pulled the Greek government into the discussions in order to make it a richer discussion. And that helped me find or propose a negotiated solution. But in answer to your question, you're right, that too is a thorny issue. And I would agree that objects acquired prior to 1970 could be requested for repatriation, and this would be absolutely fine, while noting that there are cases that are so far back that the documentation would be insufficient to allow the case to move forward. The case in point would be the Venetian Crusaders of 1204. Yeah, you need to go to the microphone, sir. This is Kevin Reinhardt, the esteemed professor of religion at Dartmouth College.
I don't want to be entirely sarcastic, but is Turkey planning to return the obelisk, for example, from the Hippodrome, or I can't remember the images of serpents that were taken from wherever it was, somewhere in Greece. Again, I'm not a classicist.
Delphi.
It seems to me that one way of thinking about this is that it's not about principle at all. It's about power, and Turkey has power now in a way that it didn't, let's say, in 1930. The power may be the power to keep you from doing your research, or it may be the power to buy Russian missiles instead of American missiles, or whatever. But that the framework within which you're trying to operate, which strikes me, of course, as principled and reasonable and so on, is not really the playing ground that these discussions are taking place on. I think this is true certainly for African artifacts, for example. Nigeria has been more successful than many countries in getting repatriation, as I understand it, in part because of the place of the Nigerian petroleum economy. So I don't want to be too cynical or too sarky, but it seems to me that this is a serious consideration as we try and formulate principles when only one side is really trying to formulate principles.
You're perfectly right. Thank you, Kevin. You're perfectly right to bring up the issue of power. Some countries are in a position of power in which they can request repatriation of antiquities taken from the region that they now control. Other countries do not have that level of power and cannot make the same request. The examples you cited are interesting cases. When the Emperor Constantine in 330 CE founded Constantinople, he founded it as the Second Rome. And he took objects from all over the empire, the Roman Empire, to Constantinople to make it a site of the greatest hits of Greek and Roman civilization. And so from the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi in central Greece, he took a monument set up after the Persian Wars, a series of snakes that supported a tripod, a bronze tripod, and on the bodies of the snakes were written the names of all the allies in Greece who had fought the Persians. Constantine took that from Delphi and put it up on the Hippodrome. He took the horses that we know of as the horses of San Marco from Rome to Constantinople, put that above a triumphal arch, and any number of other objects, obelisks too, from Rome and from other parts of the empire, and brought them all together in Constantinople. Should those be repatriated? Many of the regions, I mean, of course, the regions from which they came were part of the Roman Empire. It was a different political configuration. I don't know that any, I suppose Italy could, or Greece could say, give us back the snakes, the Delphic snakes that Constantine took in 330. And I can imagine the Turks would say, you know, Constantine founded a Greek city and spoke Greek. And so he had the right to take these snakes and put them in a Greek city, and we're not talking to you. I mean, they would also say this happened 1700 years ago and that's too far back. So the question is there a new line in the sand and where is it? It's after the Fourth Crusade of 1204. Is it after Napoleon? I'm not sure. Would anyone, there's plenty of stuff in the Louvre taken by Napoleon from plenty of other places. Some of those other places no longer exist. The Austro-Hungarian Empire no longer exists. You have Austria, you have Hungary, but you don't have the empire. So how do you formulate that? How do you determine where it should go back? There are very few cases where an object starts traveling and then ends up in a region from which it had come. The horses of San Marco are the only example that I can think of where they're made for an arch in Rome, maybe the Parthian arch of Nero on the Capitoline Hill. Constantine takes them to Constantinople in 330. The Venetian Crusaders take them from Constantinople in 1204 to Venice. Napoleon takes them from Venice to the Louvre, to top the Triumphal Arch in the Place du Carrousel in the early 19th century. Then they're repatriated back to Venice. So they've ended up in Italy, and it was from Italy that they originally came. That's the exception, not the rule. In order for us to maintain any sanity and legal procedure that will stand up in court regarding all of this, I think we do somehow need to establish a new line in the sand. I'm not sure where that line is anymore. The only one I know that's been reestablished is 1906. Once we get into the 19th century and all the wars of liberation and changing borders of nations, I'm not sure that we could figure it out anymore. There's also the issue of countries like Turkey, which were once an empire, controlling regions from which they took antiquities, and those regions are now independent countries. So one of the questions that's arisen with something like the Alexander sarcophagus, one of the greatest Greek sarcophagi, or I suppose I should say Greco-Anatolian sarcophagi that's ever been found, dating to about 300 BC, and with much of the paint still surviving and not containing the body of Alexander, but featuring Alexander in the reliefs. This was taken from an area that is now Lebanon. At the time it was taken, which was the late 19th century, it was under Ottoman control. Should Turkey repatriate that to Lebanon, because even though Lebanon was a part of the Ottoman Empire at the time in which it was taken, Lebanon is now its own sovereign country. Lebanon has not requested it for repatriation. I doubt they would. I can imagine that Turkey would say no. But if they said no, then they would have to acknowledge that the situation is grayer than they had earlier indicated. That's a very long and wandering answer, but it's a very long and wandering problem that we're all still trying to solve, or at least to make a better sense of.
So I'm still curious about your position about the destruction of monuments.
Me too.
So, so one thing I was wondering about is how you would deal with the situation of the destruction of the Berlin Wall, for example, because there are pieces of the Berlin Wall in museums all over the world, even in like Missouri, and you can buy pieces of the Berlin Wall from
I've got
like,
one.
museum gift shop. Yeah, I have one too. So I'm curious about how you would kind of deal with that situation where you need like immediate destruction of a monument.
Yeah, great question. I lived for a semester in Berlin, and I gave this some thought. The wall was a case where I would have left part of the wall standing, and they did initially leave part of the wall standing, and there is still a little bit of the wall standing, at least there was the last time I went to Berlin, so that not all of it is gone. There's one chunk of the Berlin Wall standing as a memorial to what had once been there. But clearly the community felt that to leave the wall standing would have been unthinkable. It would have reminded them on a daily basis of the fact that they had once been a divided city within a divided country, and no one wanted to see this happen. What they did in order to create a trigger to the memory of the wall without it being too outré was to put lines of metal, I think, in the street that replicated the line of the Berlin Wall. So you could see where it was and which neighborhoods had been divided, but only if you went looking for it. It wouldn't have been apparent to any bystander, anyone traveling through the area wouldn't have noticed this remnant of the Berlin Wall memorialized in the kinds of materials that they used in the street. But anyone who wanted to remember the role of the Berlin Wall in dividing a nation would have been able to see it and feel it and think about it. So you have to be creative as an urban planner and sensitive to the needs of the community while trying to maintain remnants of history to the extent that you can without wounding the community. And I think Berlin, with the wall, has done it pretty well. You're all asking very good questions. And again, I only wish Patty Gerstenblith were here.
Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it. In it, you mentioned about how currently some cultural artifacts from antiquity are being kind of appropriated for modern ideological aims.
And have been for a long time.
Do you believe that is essentially an archaeologist's job to worry about those modern appropriations?
I don't really worry about the appropriations. I document them and I put them in lectures and make everyone aware of them. I don't spend any time worrying about them. When Saddam Hussein set up a replica of the Ishtar Gate of Babylon in central Baghdad and inserted into it a giant portrait of himself as a second Nebuchadnezzar, a second Babylonian king recreating the greatness of ancient Mesopotamia, I didn't worry at all. I thought, this is fascinating. This is just like Augustus and Aeneas or Mussolini and Augustus. When the Shah of Iran celebrated the 2,500th year anniversary of the foundation of the Persian Empire in 1973, I didn't worry at all. I thought it was fascinating because, again, he was doing what had been done by the rulers of Persia, of Egypt, of Greece, and of Rome. So I don't worry about it. I'm fascinated by it. I document it, I publish it, and I use it in classes. And it will happen forever because it has for the last 5,000 years. So I suspect it's not going to end anytime soon. I mean, in Turkey, they now play Ottoman marching music for the army. It's as if the greatness of the Ottoman army is being summoned back to the present. There are many examples of this. Sound and light shows play into this as well.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about artifacts that were technically acquired legally, but under dubious circumstances. For example, I'm from New Jersey and I've been to New York City a lot, and there's an Egyptian obelisk in Central Park behind the Met that was technically acquired legally by the United States.
It was a gift.
there are
by one of the officials in Egypt, not. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say that was acquired legally, but you can't help but think about like the imperialist contexts that led to that acquisition, being
Sure.
the construction of the Suez Canal. So what, I just want like, what are your thoughts on like if Egypt today were to say like, hey, like we gave this to you, but we felt extremely pressured to. It wasn't like a true gift. It was more coerced.
Let me say, thank you. Let me say two things to that. Every archaeologist would like to see the objects from a particular region or site return to that region or site because it makes our research infinitely easier. So would I like to see Cleopatra's Needle in Central Park return to Egypt? I would. I don't know what, so this is an obelisk, probably all of you know it, in Central Park, called Cleopatra's Needle. There's a similar one in London. Both of them were the obelisks that adorned the entrance to the Kaiser Rayon in Alexandria, the ruler cult center that Cleopatra set up to honor Julius Caesar. I don't know what the legal documents look like, and I would have to see the legal documents. I don't know who signed the transfer order. If it was the Ministry of Culture in Egypt that sanctioned this and said, we are giving this as a gift to New York because of X, Y, and Z. If that is a legal document, then I would honor the legal document, while at the same time hoping that all the obelisks could someday go back to Egypt because our research would be so much easier.
Hi, Salima Ikram came and spoke in our class and kind of proposed the idea that if Egypt has 1,000 of some specific antiquity, then it makes sense for it to be displayed, for some of those objects to go overseas and be displayed in other places so that people can, fester their interests in a different culture. Do you find this idea problematic or potentially agree with it, or?
It's Egypt's decision as to which objects should travel, for how long they should travel, and where they should go. That is Egypt's decision. Looters can't say, well, they're not going to miss this. They have 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 cylinder seals. I'm only taking one of them. They won't miss it. That's not our decision to make. That's Egypt's decision to make. Is it too bad that they don't have enough museums in the country to be able to display the objects that they have in their storerooms? It is. Should they have a bigger economy for museums so that they can hire more guards so that more galleries in the existing museums can be open? Yes, it would be great if that could happen. The same is true in Turkey and most of the other countries where I've worked, including Italy. But it's Egypt's decision as to what goes out on long-term loan. Now, if I were in charge of the Egyptian Ministry of Culture, I would do something that was done in Italy in the late 1980s. I would say, we have all of these objects in our storerooms. Here's what we have. Would you like these on long-term loan? Our condition is that you conserve them. And we're giving you some of our most damaged objects that need expensive conservation that we don't have the money for. And if you conserve them, then you can have them on loan for 30 years and then you send them back to us. Or you can have them on loan for 5 years and then you send them back to us. It has to be a reciprocal arrangement, a mutually beneficial arrangement. If you do that, then I think that would be better for everyone. Egypt would get its antiquities conserved by top-of-the-line conservators, and antiquities with a known archaeological context would go to the museums in areas that don't have those kinds of antiquities, and they could create far richer stories that would bring in far more people. So yes, that's certainly something that bears thinking about.
Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned how the role of museums in the 21st century is kind of up in the air and they're kind of struggling to stay relevant. I was wondering, also because I listened to Patty Gerstenbliss' lecture as well, and she talks about how the idea of the universal museum doesn't really work because it's kind of impossible for museums to be universal to everyone and for everyone to have access equally. And so I'm wondering what museums do you think have done this particularly well or have adapted kind of to the different demands of the 21st century?
What museums have adapted the best to the complexities of the 21st century?
And have been able to kind of broaden their outreach and allow more people to access?
That's a good question. have any. You know, my experiences with the Penn Museum, we reach out now to everybody. Let me just talk about the Penn Museum because I don't know exactly what the strategic plan of the Met is, or the British Museum, or the Louvre, or all the other encyclopedic museums, but I do know what we've done. We have a lot of objects from Benin that we bought on the art market in the late 19th century, these objects having been stolen from Benin in Africa in the late 19th century. We have reached out to the government of Benin and offered them offered to discuss repatriation of the objects because we acquired them from soldiers who had no right to them. They simply stole them, these British soldiers in the late 19th century. And we have put up signs or text panels around the objects saying these objects are stolen. These were stolen by British soldiers from Benin in the late 19th century. So we've been honest about our acquisitions in a way that 10 years ago would have been unthinkable. So we've been telling the truth publicly about our acquisitions. That's rare. That's very rare because you're inviting repatriation requests, and that can create larger problems with the leaders of your institution. So for example, with the Troy gold, Penn bought the Troy gold in 1966, 24 pieces of gold jewelry in perfect condition dating to 2400 BC, $10,000. Those objects are now worth $10 million, or even 20. I mean, the insurance company said, put a price on them. I said, they're priceless. They said, fine, put a price on them. So I said $10 million, which I pulled out of nowhere. But if we had sent those to Turkey and said, these were stolen, we give up our rights to them, they're yours. That's $10 million that leaves Penn's endowment at the same time. So the president was concerned about this, and this is true for a lot of museums, if the objects have a value that high. So we've been honest about our acquisitions. One thing I've been trying to do is reach out to more groups, out to whom we never reached before. So I started a program for the blind. We have a lot of Egyptian monuments, which we have legally from the Egyptian government because we excavated these sites. And as you know from any number of your lecturers, in the old days, a century and a half ago, there was a system called partage. You split the archaeological discoveries that you made 50-50 with the host country. So all of ours are legal. I just thought I'd add that as a footnote. But we have a lot. We have a sphinx. We have columns of the throne room of the palace of Merempta, the son of Ramses II, and the inscriptions, the hieroglyphs, are deeply sunk in the granite. So if you teach blind groups the fundamentals of hieroglyphics, they can read the hieroglyphs as if they were Braille. So we've increased our programs for the blind. We've increased our programs for primary school students. And for secondary school students. There's now a program where every sixth grader in the city of Philadelphia is brought to the Penn Museum, and they get cultural heritage education on a low level, but they get it, in both Egypt and in Rome. And one of the reasons I pushed that was as a result of that burning of the Quran. I thought, if only I could have reached that minister when he was 7 years old, before he learned how to hate cultures different from his own, then maybe none of this would have happened. So most museums have now reached out to children before their viewpoints have hardened, as a way of encouraging them to become stakeholders in cultural heritage protection from childhood, and ideally they will carry it on into adulthood. Veterans, our programs, Veterans Read Homer. You have this here at Dartmouth. Roberta Stewart has a Veterans Read Homer program. We have one too. I take them through the galleries, and we talk about the lives of the warriors who fought in the Trojan War on the Greek and Trojan sides, the post-traumatic stress that they experienced. They talk about their post-traumatic stress. It becomes a kind of healing dialogue. So I think many of us are much better at realizing that we had neglected most groups in society prior to now. I think if there's any positive byproduct to the wars, at least for me, it completely changed my thinking about objects, about outreach, about society, about archaeology in general. And I think that's true for a lot of museum officials, archaeologists, humanists in general. So most museum officials that you query, asking them the kinds of questions that you asked me, will probably be able to present you with a list of the groups out to whom they've now reached. But this will have happened only in the last 10 years. Fewer will be as honest as we are about our acquisitions, but I think that's coming. So very good question, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to Dr. Rose for this fantastic talk, and thank you to everyone for coming.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you.